I had the pleasure to meet our panelists briefly in preparation for the panel today, and I can tell you that we're in for a great discussion about the next chapter of the economy post-COVID-19. I will introduce each of our panelists as I ask each of them questions so we can get right to it. I will start with some big picture questions on the economic outlook, and then I will ask some more specific questions about the transition period and the international aspects of this crisis. So I have the pleasure to start by introducing Dr. Daniel Dodgen. Dr. Daniel Dodgen is the Senior Advisor for Strategy, Policy Plans, and Requirements with the Assistant Secretary of Preparedness and Response at the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services, HHS. His portfolio includes national health security, health system policy, behavioral health, community resilience, at-risk individuals, opioids, and other cross-departmental initiatives. Dr. Dodgen served as the Executive Director of the White House, directed National Advisory Group on Disaster Mental Health. He led components of the federal response efforts for Hurricanes Katrina, Sandy, Gustav, Ike, Dean, and Sandy, the H1N1 epidemic, the BP oil spill, the Boston Marathon bombing, the Sandy Hook school shooting, COVID-19, and other natural and man-made disasters. He was the lead author for the impacts of climate change on human health in the United States, a scientific assessment released by the White House in 2016. He was the first emergency management coordinator for the Substance Abuse and Mental Health Services Administration. Dr. Dodgen also served as an advisor to the government of Greece and the State Department on preparedness for the 2004 Summer Olympics in Athens, Greece. Before joining HHS, Dr. Dodgen served as a special assistant to the CEO and senior federal affairs officer at the American Psychological Association, APA, following a fellowship with the U.S. House of Representatives Committee on Education. He's a trained American Red Cross disaster mental health worker with whom he responded to the Los Angeles riots, the Northridge earthquake, the Oklahoma City bombings, and the September 11 Pentagon attacks. Following the Pentagon attack, Dr. Dodgen co-founded the Metropolitan Washington Mental Health Community Response Coalition and served as its chairman. He received the American Psychological Association 2005 Early Career Award for the contribution to psychology in the public interest and was elected a fellow of APA in 2012. He's on the board of directors of the International Association of Applied Psychology and the Child Maltreatment section of APA. He received his bachelor's degree in Spanish and psychology at USC and its MA and PhD in clinical psychology at the University of Houston. In 2016, Dr. Dodgen was selected as a Harvard Kennedy School Senior Executive Fellow. He's a licensed clinical psychologist in Washington, D.C. So you can see my excitement about this wonderful background. So Daniel, given that incredible background and perspective and having seen our country through so many crises, how do you expect this one to compare?
Thanks, Paulina. Thanks for the great introduction, and thanks to USC and the Dornsife School for inviting me to be part of this amazing panel and this, I think, really, really important conversation. I think it's important to talk about how disasters are all the same, as well as how they're all different. As you mentioned, I've experienced a lot of disasters and worked on them, from school shootings to pandemics to hurricanes to earthquakes. And there's two things that I think I'll always see after any disaster, regardless of the nature of it. One is that long after the funerals have been held, long after people are out of the hospital, long after the buildings are rebuilt, the mental health consequences continue. And I think it's important to remember that. I think it's also important to remember that disasters always expose the weaknesses in our communities, whether that's an economic challenge, whether that's an access issue, whether it's just that we don't have good zoning laws and we're building houses where we shouldn't, whatever the vulnerabilities and weaknesses are in our communities, disasters always expose them. So COVID obviously has had these two things that I've talked about, like all things do, like all disasters do. But there are some things that are unique about this disaster that I think are important for us to keep in mind. First off, it's affecting all 50 states in the US, and I'm focusing on the US response right now, and the territories, the District of Columbia. You know, in other disasters, let's say there's a hurricane in Texas, people from New Mexico or Oklahoma might send teams down to help. We haven't been able to do that here because everybody is addressing the issue at the same time. The other thing is we've had other crises emerge in our culture at the same time the COVID crisis was happening. Obviously, the civil rights protests are the best example of that. I think another thing that's important to remember from a psychological perspective is people have the greatest anxiety about things that are invisible and unpredictable. And COVID is both of those things, right? It's unpredictable in the sense that we don't know who's going to get it. You don't know if you've been exposed. And we do know that everybody reacts differently. It doesn't affect all people the same. It's invisible, of course, because it's a virus, right? So is there COVID on that cereal box that you just brought in from the grocery store? Do you need to wipe everything down? We know surface transmission isn't as big a deal as we thought, but it's still a big deal. So these are all things that are unique about this. And of course, all the things that are unique about COVID exacerbate the first two things I mentioned. So they exacerbate the behavioral health consequences, and they exacerbate the way that this disaster is exposing challenges and weaknesses that were already in our system. So that, I think, is the short answer to how it's the same, but also how it's different.
Thanks so much, Daniel. So our next panelist is Robert Kleinhenz. Dr. Robert Kleinhenz is principal economist and founder of the firm Kleinhenz Economics, a leading voice on the economy at the national, state, and local level. Dr. Kleinhenz brings over 30 years of experience to his public speaking, economic studies, and policy analysis. Dr. Kleinhenz has spoken to a variety of audiences that include leaders in business, government, the nonprofit sector, and education. A frequent contributor to the media, he has appeared on CNBC, Bloomberg, NPR, and KNX Radio, and has been quoted in the Wall Street Journal, the Los Angeles Times, and publications in California and the US. Kleinhenz previously served as economist and executive director of research with Beacon Economics, chief economist for the Los Angeles County Economic Development Corporation, and deputy chief economist with the California Association of Realtors. He's currently on the faculty at Cal State Long Beach and held previous academic positions at USC, UC Riverside, and Cal State Fullerton. Kleinhenz holds a PhD in economics from the University of Southern California with a specialty in urban and regional economics. He also holds a master's in economics from the University of Southern California and a bachelor's degree in economics from the University of Michigan. So thanks, Robert, for being with us. And Robert, as of now, there seems to be some agreement about the economy losing 2 to 3 years of GDP, a lot similar to the Great Recession. However, there is a much broader range of estimates regarding the pace of recovery. Will it be slow, like after the Great Recession, or are there signs that point towards healthy growth of the GDP in the next year or so?
Thanks, Paulina, and thanks for the opportunity to be on today's program. I'm very excited not only to participate, but also to learn what I can from the other panelists today. So, the big question right now is what letter is going to characterize the recovery of the economy, but it kind of overlooks the fact that we are in a situation where we're in the middle of an economic contraction, but it was brought on for much different reasons than what we've seen in the past with economic contractions, with recessions and so on, including the Great Recession. The numbers that we've seen are just staggering. We've seen our unemployment rate nationally go from 3.5% earlier this year to 14.7% by April. It has come down a bit, at least based on the official number. And GDP likely will fall, as you pointed out in your introduction, by somewhere in the neighborhood of $2 trillion, which would roll us back to GDP levels from around 2017. So we will find ourselves, and mind you, I think it's important to point out that while we have seen all this occur, it's never occurred with such speed as we've seen in this economic downturn, right? Mm-hmm. But by the same token, arguably, we are probably already bottomed out and beginning to recover. So formally, the National Bureau of Economic Research declared that the expansion ended in February, that the current recession began in February, starting February, March. And so if we bottom out now, that is to say by the end of this second quarter, recovery really is either in June or beginning in the second half of this year. When you look at the math, it's really hard to imagine us doing anything but growing out of this with something like a swoosh, a Nike swoosh kind of trajectory, because it's going to take some time for businesses and households to get used to the safety and health protocols that are in place. They're figuring that out right now. I live here in California, and so we're just a few weeks into reopening the economy. We have a ways to go before establishments across the board reopen fully. There are certain guidelines and requirements that are in place at this time. That part's going to take time. So we're going to ramp up slowly. I anticipate that we recover GDP that was lost in the first half of this year sometime late in 2021. I think that's on the optimistic side, more likely sometime in 2022. And that duration for economic recovery is about average for economic cycles in recent decades. Now, the labor market, 14.7% unemployment, 13.3 in the month of May, that will come down more slowly. It's a little bit hard to predict what this is going to look like because we've never seen a pandemic shutdown and recovery before. But if economic cycles, if this bears any resemblance to past economic cycles, the labor market tends to lag recovery as GDP comes back. So I'll leave it at that. Thanks.
Thanks so much, Robert. So my next panelist is Marsha Ershaghi Hames. Dr. Marsha Ershaghi Hames is a partner with Tapestry Networks and a leader in the corporate governance practice. She advises non-executive directors, C-suite executives, and in-house counsel on issues related to governance, culture transformation, board leadership, and stakeholder engagement. Prior, as managing director of LRN Incorporated, Dr. Ershaghi Hames spent nearly 2 decades advising corporate boards and executive teams on transforming organizational culture, designing effective compliance strategies, and promoting great leadership accountability around culture through education and communication initiatives. And here's an impressive fact. She's advised over 30 of the Fortune 50. She believes in compliance matters are no longer just legal issues, but business and reputation priorities. Dr. Ershaghi Hames has been interviewed and cited by the media, including CNBC, CNN, Ethisphere, HR Magazine, Compliance Week, and the Society of Corporate Compliance and Ethics. She hosted Principle, the podcast series sponsored by LRN, that profiled the stories of some of the top transformational leaders in business. Dr. Ershaghi Hames is an expert fellow serving at USC Neely Center for Ethical Leadership and Decision Making, and is contributing author of the USC Neely Center's forthcoming book entitled Next Generation Ethics, Engineering a Better Society. Dr. Ershaghi Hames also serves on the advisory boards of Compliance.ai, a regulatory change management firm, and LMH Strategies Incorporated, a diversity performance management firm. So, Marsha, I would love to get your perspective on whether the impact in behavior that we see today as a consequence of COVID-19 seems to be a permanent shift, and how our firms are thinking. What are the firms? Whether these changes seem long-lasting from the perspective of the firms, and how are the firms contemplating and preparing for them?
Thank you, Paulina. And I echo my colleagues' sentiments. It's a pleasure to be here and to reconnect with the USC community. So I'll try to contribute just some perspectives about what I'm hearing today. I was actually on a board call just 2 hours before this and hearing some very fresh insight. So my perspective here is there's probably going to be 3 longer lasting kind of changes or shifts in behavior. The first I think we're all experiencing is what I'm going to characterize as the tech-powered humanity. So we're seeing how companies and organizations are really seizing the opportunity. Sometimes I think Dan mentioned crisis has, exposes vulnerabilities. So seeing the opportunity to grow and learn how to innovate and digitize their businesses. A director just said today that, for years they were saying someday we'll get to this, someday we'll get to this innovation or this idea, and someday became today. And many are now saying, why would we ever go back to the way we used to do things? So I think the first category is really the acceleration of adopting technology as an enabler. And it's helping with business continuity. We're seeing the digitization points, with consumer interactions to maintain resiliency and continuity just in the last few months. We even see with hospitals and healthcare, I don't know if anyone has already experienced a telehealth appointment where there was, I would say, cultural resistance, both from the bureaucracy and protocols of just antiquated systems, and this is how we've done it, and privacy concerns. And now both providers and patients are rapidly leaping into the opportunity to connect with their providers for critical care. And I'm pleased to see that even insurance providers are stepping up and creating new coding systems to support this. The second area I think we're going to see a big shift is operationalizing how we work. So we've already seen, the more distributed workforce, the work from home, the acceptance and the trust that is now being extended to the remote workforce, because that took a little bit of extending trust and seeing the impact. But I think that as we shift to whether it's 100% remote or in most industries, some sort of hybrid model, there will be an opportunity to transform how we develop and scale talent. We will be able to cast the net wider in terms of creating more equitable opportunities for talent recruitment, because we're no longer limited by, let's say, geographies. We can access transportation deserts where some folks otherwise wouldn't have had access. Also, with the digitization and automation and machine learning and kind of the adoption of technology, we need to be cognizant of retooling and reskilling our workforce. You know, we don't want folks to feel left behind. So as companies build that resiliency, there has to be some investment in that. And I think that the pandemic is also kind of putting a premium on human interaction. You know, maybe there will be a premium service if you have the opportunity to interact with a human in the future. So that'll be kind of fascinating. And then that leads me to the last area, which I think is the health safety protocols. So some businesses absolutely, like hospitality, travel, you're seeing they're doing everything they can to ensure and retain the trust of their consumers around the health safety protocols. But I'm hearing directors say that prioritizing health and safety may continue to actually be in direct conflict with profitability, but they're prepared to do what's the right thing. They need to do the right thing for the public health, for their workforce, and for customers, regardless of what it means for the company financially.
Thank you so much, Marsha, for this insightful answer. So I want to circle back to Robert and hear his take on this. Which sectors do you think will be the most affected by these permanent changes and or benefited, you know, to some extent?
Well, like Marsha, I think that what we have seen over the last few months was simply, in many ways, an acceleration of trends that were already underway. And so if we just think about households, for example, we of course already saw an increase in online shopping that with each passing holiday season, account for a bigger and bigger percentage of sales. I think, you know, so that was a trend that was already underway. Home delivery of things like groceries. I've got a number of friends and colleagues for whom they've turned to that, and that was not something they had done in the past. So there are a number of examples for households where there were trends already underway that have simply accelerated, and I think many of these are going to be here to stay. But you know, I can't tell you how many people I've talked to who are sort of eager to get back out to the grocery store and maybe hit the restaurants when they reopen. So there's clearly a sense that there's only so much benefit that people want to derive from these kinds of innovations, but they'll probably continue to use them. With respect to the workplace, again, there were things that were already underway. Remote work was something that was on the rise. The office footprint, the typical amount of space that offices dedicate to individual workers, has been falling for several years as more and more people are working remotely, and then the footprint, basically the space needs of individuals is now smaller because all of our equipment is smaller, our file keeping is digital. All these kinds of things have been happening for the last couple of decades at least, and have changed the way offices set themselves up and so on. And then of course automation, whether you're talking about automation on the manufacturing floor, or you're talking about us using an iPad at a restaurant to place our order before it's delivered by a person. You know, these are things that we have already seen in place. I will tell you that with respect to the Great Recession, we saw automation really have an impact on manufacturing employment during the down cycle. And that manufacturing employment did not come back. So I think, you know, we're going to see some permanent changes, but I also sense, and I'm willing to bet that all of us on this Zoom call will agree that there are some kinds of meetings and encounters that for which a face-to-face meeting is irreplaceable. And so there will be a time when we see our people, our friends and our colleagues in the flesh and not virtually. And I think a lot of people will welcome that. Thanks.
Thanks so much, Robert. And I want to go back to Marsha and talk now a little bit about the transition period. What are the top priorities for directors as companies focus on restart and recovery? What are you hearing from them?
Yeah, Paulina. So there are 4 primary areas that the directors have been focused on from the jump. Number 1 is operational. So just real stabilizing operational continuity. Secondly is scenario modeling and strategy. So what are we doing kind of longer term? The third, I would say, is financial. So financial was first 3 months ago. We're sort of shifting now to the first half of the year. So ops and strategy has moved up, but financial continues to be of concern. And then I would say, you know, again, for directors, it would be more oversight. Is there a change in the role that the board can play? So, you know, historically, boards have sort of been there to advise and guide management teams. And there has been just so much pressure with the 24/7 cycles on the CEO, CFO, COO, the cyber issues, all the risks, moving to a distributed workforce, that we're seeing that with the potential burnout, how the board has had to really step in. And they've been actively having, you know, if not weekly, almost daily meetings virtually. And that adaptation and support around oversight has made a big difference. You know, I could offer that in terms of the transition. I think that figuring out how to also support some of the mental health and economic burdens on this, on the sort of paralyzation of both on the business side and the workforce side. So as much as many are saying that, wow, this work from home is really working great, we should have done this a long time ago, I think the looming situation is that this is a real health pandemic. The health is impacted, mental health is impacted. There are families and the family ecosystem is impacted. There are childcare, educational matters. There's an entire sort of support ecosystem, aging parents, young children, and all of that pressure has been on the workforce while they're sort of holding up business continuity. And I'm sure, Dan, you're smarter than me at this in terms of, you know, your experience and research in this area, but I think there's a severe psychological impact that companies need to be sensitized to, and they need to start to engage the right stakeholders, bring them into the board, bring them into the management team to explore how best to listen and what kind of systemic processes and changes can be put into place to provide a better, I would say, bedrock or foundation for success.
Thanks so much, Marsha. And with that, I'll turn it to Daniel. So what are some things that federal and local governments can do to increase resilience among households and individuals?
I think that's a great question. I mean, obviously, this is going to have to be a part of everybody, right? There's not a top-down government solution to any of this. There probably never was, but there certainly won't be in this context. I think just as my colleague Marsha was saying, resilience really is about much more than just sort of the metrics of how people rebuild, and it's behavioral health, it's economics, it's so many things. But there really is a lot of research on post-disaster resilience and recovery, and what are the things that help communities come back after they've suffered an extreme loss. Now, again, this is unique, right? What we're dealing, as we talked about earlier, is unique, but there are some lessons I think we can learn. One of the things we know relates to resilience. With communities that have higher levels of things we call social capital, social cohesion, engage people in their communities, that engage people with each other, are very good predictors of recovery after a disaster. And those can be simple things like, do people register to vote and actually vote? Are they members of local organizations or congregations? What are the things that are markers of people's engagement in their community? Those things are often really good predictors of what communities come back and which ones don't, because communities where there are fewer of those markers tend to not come back as quickly or at all after catastrophic incidents like, for example, Hurricane Katrina. So I think it's important to keep that in mind, because I think the role of government can be to not people that have social capital or social cohesion. That would probably be counterproductive. It's by truly engaging people. And it looks like my connection might be a little unstable, but I hope you can hear me okay. If my face is flickering, that's probably no great loss as long as you can hear me. But I think that there are ways that they can foster that by promoting this kind of cohesion and capital. One of that is by engaging members of the community in decision making. Now, that doesn't mean that every member of the community gets to say, here's how I think you ought to do it, and then the local government says, oh, that's how we're going to prioritize vaccine, or that, you know, it's a complex process. But governments need to listen, and they need to foster environments that allow members of the community to participate in decision making, and at least to be able to offer their insights about the things that the community is doing in terms of planning for preparing for an event, and sort of the long term. We're going to do this better so that we can promote resilience in our communities over time. So I think those things are very important. I think that's where the government can have a role. And I think the challenges, will be exactly what Marsha and I think Robert were also talking about, which is that we're now in a new world, right? Where the way we used to do town hall meetings was we brought everyone into a gymnasium or whatever and had these conversations. So it's also going to be up to local government and to national government to foster ways that continue to allow people to engage in these conversations in non-traditional ways, because we're not going to be able to just all meet in a gym or whatever ways to do that. And I think that that's going to be a challenge that we're going to have to work on collectively. I think the other piece, I don't want to take too much time, is we're also going to all collectively, everybody in the USC family and outside it as well, is we're going to have to get over our ADHD. And we can't continue to just focus on the most recent disaster that we experienced. Right now, we're all about pandemics and we're all about COVID, as we should be. But we can't forget that we do still need to be preparing for wildfires in California and for hurricanes and flooding on the East Coast and for perhaps snowstorms or other things that can happen elsewhere. So we also have to be better at maintaining these efforts, even in times when everything appears to be fine. Because sometimes the reason we get caught unprepared is because we've gone to sleep a little bit, because there hasn't been an earth. I mean, think how long it's been since California's had a really serious earthquake. But eventually it's going to happen. Are we continuing that effort? Or are we so focused on COVID that we're forgetting? So we need to be thinking, how do we maintain the effort? How do we maintain these activities? And how do we do it in a way that doesn't sell short what we need to do to respond to COVID, but we're still preparing for other things simultaneously?
Yeah, those are important things to remember. Thanks, Daniel. And Robert, do you want to add to this briefly?
Yeah, just very briefly, because I've had occasion to work with local government agencies over the last few years, and in the wake of the Great Recession, it seems as though more and more local governments are taking a proactive and systemic approach to doing exactly what Daniel is describing, getting ready ahead of time for that eventual economic or natural disaster. For the longest time, we've thought about how we've got economic policy at the national level, macroeconomic policy that responds to economic downturns, for example, and FEMA responds to natural and other types of disasters. But more and more cities and counties that I've come across here in California are actually developing resiliency plans, specifically with my involvement on the economic front. And that's fairly novel. I think it's a great move because so many of these things play out on Main Street and, in households and neighborhoods. So we really need to have local government think seriously about a systemic approach that enables them to understand what levers they have at their disposal, to be able to leverage the support they get from state and federal government when an economic disaster occurs, such as this one. And there's got to be some premeditation involved in order to make sure that that occurs as smoothly as possible. And there's got to be some institutional knowledge that enables when the baton is passed from one set of leaders to the next, that enables this to occur with some continuity. And all that I'm referring to essentially at the local and county level is very important. And we have information like never before on the local economy, local economic indicators and socioeconomic indicators that can inform that preparation and resiliency model. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Robert. So let me turn back to Daniel. So we've seen quite a bit of heterogeneity in both kind of the health outcomes and also the economic outcomes stemming from this crisis. So how are public health departments thinking about these differences towards the road to recovery?
Yeah, I think it's also, of course, it's a great question. I think probably many people on the line are familiar with the concept of social determinants of health, right? That things that determine our health outcomes often are not things that we traditionally have thought of as health. They're access to access to safe, healthy housing, access to food, access to other kinds of services. All of those things have a huge impact on your health, right? I mean, if you're living in an apartment that has an insect or rodent infestation, it's going to have huge consequences for your health. And yet often those things aren't really considered part of sort of the health mandate, right? So we need to be thinking more broadly about the social determinants of health if we want to address some of these inequities that you mentioned earlier. Now, public health departments know this, right? They know this. This is, social determinants of health. It's not a new concept. People know it. It's in Healthy People 2020 if anyone wants to look it up and learn more about it. And there's other places you can look up it as well. I think the challenge is that the folks who do housing are in the housing department, and the folks who do education are in the education department, and the folks who do social services are in the social services department, and the folks who do behavioral health are in the behavioral health department. And I think one of the challenges, but something that we need to overcome, is because we tend to have siloed departments and we tend to have siloed funding streams, it actually can be counterproductive when you need to actually get people together in a situation like COVID, where you really do have unique impacts because of ethnic status, because of just age, the kind of community living setting that you're in, for example, for the nursing homes and senior facilities. And I think because there's disincentive sometimes in all these groups working together in when we're not facing a disaster or a disease, then it becomes really a challenge to do that. So it's not that public health people don't know this, and it's not that the other people don't know this too, but we do need to overcome those things. I mean, we need to start rethinking how do we really pull the people together to form coalitions and to form a more unified effort in how we can respond to this. And I think those are the kinds of things that people have been thinking about for a long time, but I think there's more action that's starting to happen. And I think people are now at a place where if we're opportunistic and we take advantage of what's happening now, I think we can actually create some real change in how organizations work together and how groups that are traditionally siloed work together. Because I think, I think we're seeing that those silos don't work anymore. And I think certainly public health agencies are aware of that and probably very willing to collaborate, but we need to start coming up with ways to foster that collaboration more successfully.
Yeah, that seems very important. Thanks so much.
If I could jump on a point that Dan made, if you don't mind.
Please.
The theme of collaboration and partnership, that would be one of the greatest lessons and outcomes from this scenario, because this is not just affecting us here in the US, it's a global challenge right now. And I think that, at the top of this year, there was this big kind of discussion around ESG, environmental social governance, and kind of coming out of Davos and the World Economic Forum. There was a big focus on that. You may have remembered all the discussion around climate change. And a lot of folks are saying right now that we may have shifted from the E to the S, meaning social purpose, social issues, social governance. And when you look at kind of the primary economic engine of society, it's the corporation, it's the business, it's employment. So this presents an opportunity to look at how can the social community, the partnerships with government and corporations find better ways to engage and find a more balanced partnership. Whether, again, it's talent, recruitment, infrastructure, and so forth. But I would be remiss if I didn't sort of call out to all the participants that are listening. I think we're all very well aware of the demonstrations and protests that have gripped the world right now. And it's really kind of pushing to the forefront this uncomfortable dialogue around equity and justice. And Dan, you mentioned access. And if you look at something as simple as our wonderful students here at USC, when universities shut down, one of the big issues was access to internet. There were hundreds of thousands of students across the US from a K through 12 all the way through higher ed who simply didn't have access to the ability to continue their education. And some may think that's a simple access issue, but it's actually a very revealing challenge. And as workforces and corporations scrambled to provide secure IT infrastructure, higher ed institutions were also trying to determine continuity as well. And I think that going back to this point of collaboration, I think that there is an opportunity here for corporations to be a part of the solution. How they procure, how they innovate, how they hire, and so forth. And I think that there's an opportunity to inculcate new behaviors, new systems, and new policies. And furthermore, what I'm hearing from directors is if corporations take action early and do this sort of partnership outreach, it will help solidify and build trust with consumers, supply chain, and the workforce. And when that's humming, you have an opportunity, because we're not going back. I know a lot of participants are asking, are we going back to the old normal? We're not, we know that. But in order to define what the new normal looks like, we have to sort of seize the reins and work in partnership better.
Thanks so much, Marsha. I think these are excellent comments. And if I may, can I just ask a little bit more of a follow-up to that comment in terms of the heterogeneity across firms as well, because different firms, according to the size, are going to have very different capacity to provide, to engage, right? In terms of resources, in terms of their size, the level of engagement with their employees. How do you see the role of companies of all sorts jumping into these issues?
I can provide a lens, and I'd love to hear from my colleagues. So there are opportunities actually to do mentor work with larger firms and smaller firms. And there are certainly ways through the Small Business Administration and other types of small business programs that are government funded and at a local level to find ways for mentorship with smaller firms and larger firms so that they can collaborate together towards building, what are the common opportunities where, let's say, a larger firm says, look, we need to solve this problem and we want to actually help support the smaller guys, the smaller gals, the mom and pop shops, so that you can build kind of a more balanced approach to the thinking process and the perspectives. Because if corporations that have historically made decisions in a certain way for a certain audience don't get the perspective or lens from different types of businesses and different types of business owners and different types of suppliers, then you're not going to innovate. But I'd love to hear from my colleagues.
Daniel, Robert, do you want to jump in on that one?
I mean, I would just make two quick comments. These are the economists below me, at least on my screen in the Brady Bunch squares here. But I think two things that are important to remember. First off is healthcare is by and large a private industry in the United States. And so when we think about working with the private sector, let's make sure that we're really thinking about healthcare. Healthcare is not, for the most part, taking place in the public sector in this country. So it's a really, really important partner. And I think another partner in all this, of course, is foundations. I mean, I think, and we were talking about resilience, the Rockefeller Foundation spent, I think it's $500 million on the Rockefeller 100 Resilient Cities, which is a global initiative to help cities identify where there are areas of greatest need and how can they build resilience. You can go to their website and find out more information. I'm not here to plug Rockefeller, but I'm here to say, like, there's a lot of money invested in this space from the foundation side. And I think, again, the de-siloing that we've been talking about earlier, I think we really need to be including all the partners who have a stake in this conversation. We can't keep having these kind of separate projects. And I've seen in the comments, some people have mentioned some places where there's really good collaboration happening across the private sector, foundations, and government sector. And I think those are the kinds of things we're going to have to look to if we're going to really seriously create a new normal after all of this is over.
Thanks, Daniel. So let me then turn to a couple of questions on the international aspects of this crisis. So first to Robert, how will the U.S. economic comeback will be impacted by the global health and economic crisis that's happening along?
Well, okay, so let's first understand where the U.S. economy is in relative to its trading partners and so on. We often hear that 70% of our economy is the consumer sector, and that's true. When you consider the government sector as well as the business sector, about 90% of our economy is domestic in nature. So we're not as reliant, for example, on trade, certainly on the export portion of trade, as other countries, as important trading partners such as Germany, China, or even maybe if you want to, I don't know if they're less important, they're certainly on the top 10, like Vietnam. They're countries that are much more reliant on trade than we are, and they are going to be much more adversely affected, I think, by all that has happened than the U.S. When you take a look at past economic cycles and you see how the U.S. has fared with respect to its recovery compared to its trading partners and other major nations, we oftentimes recover more quickly. And that's because we have an internal economic dynamic that can pull us out of these problems maybe a little bit faster than other places. So I'm in a holistic sense, I'm not as concerned about our recovery. I think we will in time recover. Certain sectors of the economy will be affected on the international scale. I mean, on an international level, tourism, of course, being one, and international trade being another. Let's keep in mind that all of this has occurred against the backdrop of changes in trade policy that have occurred over the last several years that have been brought forth by the current administration. And so I would not be surprised if, when you take the combination of the trade stance that we've adopted relative to our trade partners in recent years, and this, if we pull back a little bit from the rest of the world in terms of our economic integration. And that's a big deal, because over the last 20, 25 years, we've become increasingly integrated with the rest of the world, both in terms of trade and in terms of our financial system. I mean, one of the reasons why we had a great recession that went global was because of our global financial integration. But I do sense that there may be some retrenchment in response to this, at least until we get our some solutions in place with respect to the health problem that this pandemic represents, and then we will move forward from there. But there are other things that are, also affecting the situation, our global situation at this time.
Thanks so much, Robert. And I'd like to turn a version of this question to Marsha. How are you seeing companies reassessing their supply chains as a result of this pandemic-driven uncertainty?
Yeah, Paulina. So, supply chain. Who didn't go to Amazon within day 3 to order their life, right? And who received the "it'll be available indefinitely" response? So, I think we all experienced some version of that. And so with the shift in consumer behavior and all of us becoming far more comfortable with e-commerce and just quick digital access without even checking the sources. That's what's so interesting. We weren't even checking where things were coming from. We just needed it right now. What we ran into were the geographical and geopolitical factors, right? So I'm not an economist. Robert, I'm going to lean on you, but I think it was evident to the world if things are shut down in China and India and Mexico, even if Georgia wants to reopen or Texas wants to reopen, if the plant is in Mexico and they're on a different set of manufacturing protocols, you're not getting your supply chain still paralyzed. So I think what happened is companies started trying to determine, should we start evaluating moving some aspects of manufacturing stateside and absorb those higher costs to sort of control or mitigate certain risks? And I think that some of these impairments around the instability of geographical changes. So it was sort of like, well, what are the country-specific regulations? There was a lack of consistency as things were unfolding. And it's almost like, I am a native of California, so I'll use the earthquake analogy. It's like these aftershocks kept happening. it wasn't like something hit and we were sort of focused on solving it. It's the aftershock. So, well, what is open? What isn't open? And so because a lot of different country and geographic kind of barriers were set, were subject to different reopen protocols, it was really a handbrake to the supply chain. So longer term right now, the directors that I'm engaging with are saying that they're talking to management to take a kind of a deeper look at the overall resource ecosystem. Many, especially again, as a result of, I think, the demonstrations and protests around inequity that are going on, are also using this as an opportunity smartly to create a lens into the supplier diversity strategy. So as they look at options here stateside, are there ways, again, to work with minority-owned, women-owned, veteran-owned, disabled-owned, so forth? Are there ways to enable aspects of our economy that are business owners that could have actually supported us during this? So I think it comes down to boards also getting the right stakeholders in the room. They need to have access to the right data points. It's also an opportunity to revisit how sourcing is done, how procurement is done. There's a lot of kind of historic ways that things have been done, and that's a culture opportunity. And I also think, lastly, that organizations are starting to explore agility and more nimble supply chains as they kind of explore diversifying their strategy. What's interesting is the biggest push is the consumer. So it's not like corporations are like, oh, let's take a pause and really explore our supply chain strategy. The consumer demand, the shifts in demand, the pressure points are forcing organizations to look at this as an opportunity to really grow.
That's an excellent. Yeah, go
jump
ahead.
In that we're kind of at an opportune moment for these things to occur, because as we discussed earlier, there have been a variety of innovations that were already occurring that have been accelerated by virtue of this pandemic. And so, improvements and more widespread thing in automation, for example, in manufacturing processes, might make an infeasible reshoring of a manufacturing facility in the United States feasible at some point in time.
Mm-hmm.
So there's some, there's a confluence of events right now that if the right people are, as you say, Marsha, in the room to evaluate the information and to make those calls at that point in time, make those decisions, they might be able to make some things happen that might have seemed just, completely crazy not too long ago. But there's just so much potential that we have discovered, I think you could say, as we have employed more technology both in the home and in the workplace. And we just need to get bright minds in the same room or maybe the same Zoom meeting to figure some of these things out in order to move forward successfully. Thank you.
Thanks, Robert. So I'd like to have a couple of questions from the audience. So I'd like to bunch a couple of them. So there were a couple of questions about what's going to be the economic transition to those that have lost their jobs, basically. So the PPP payments are running out at the end of this month. And, how are those people going to be able to pay their rents? And on a related question, are food banks, an adequate response to people that are having trouble meeting their most basic needs? Is this going to be enough? I'll put it out there to anybody who wants to answer.
Well, maybe I'll start off and then you can correct any mistakes that I make, Marsha and Dan. I've been had occasion to hear from local city leaders in Southern California who in turn have spoken with their local businesses, and some have expressed concerns about their ability to resume their numbers of employees, having the numbers of employees on staff that they had before the recession. There may be, they may have them on payroll through the duration of the PPP, but a significant percentage may be let loose permanently. By significant, I'm hearing anywhere between 15 and 40% of the workforce, and this is all anecdotal, so we can't exactly hang our hats on that. But there's some real serious concerns about firms' ability to bring its workers back in the short run. But I think that we need to look at this on an industry by industry basis. You know, the lion's share of the job losses that we saw over the last few months occurred in leisure and hospitality, primarily in restaurants. Somewhere in the neighborhood of 60% in the month of March, and then about 30% over the 2-month period, February through April. So I think that's a sector that's going to come back slowly, as will retail. Other sectors like construction have already recovered. These are national numbers, somewhere in the neighborhood of half of the lost jobs that they encountered during that period from March and April. So it's going to vary by industry, and there will be, undoubtedly, there's going to be fallout because firms are going to let people go after the PPP expires if they don't see a pickup in their business. Now, we saw that through fiscal policy, we threw $3.3 trillion at households, small businesses, corporations, and so on. So that will help us. That includes the PPP, of course, and a number of other programs. So that will help us through the short term. And in the absence of that, we would really have been in a very deep hole, even right now. But again, I got to turn to technology and acknowledge the fact that by virtue of technology, many enterprises have been able to operate, if not at full capacity, close to full capacity. Thankfully, because we have so many aspects of our businesses that are either service oriented or that are mainly information oriented, such that they can take advantage of these technologies. So we could be a whole lot worse off. There will be some damage to the economy, supply chains, as well as labor. And, we're going to be in a very difficult time during the second half of this year, even as we see signs of recovery.
Thanks so much, Robert. So I think we have just a few minutes left, and I would like panelists to take a few minutes to give any concluding remarks if they want to, or address some of the questions if you want to as well, that have been asked by the audience or that have been discussed already. So, sorry, I should say who. So why don't we start with Marsha?
Sure. I do see that there is a listener who's specifically asking me to address a question around the conflicts of interest around profitability versus health safety protocols. Again, I've spoken to probably 50, 60 directors just in the last month or so, and I spoke to 100 directors the prior 90 days. And the consistent theme that I'm hearing is they're very much focused on health safety protocols. They are developing them. They're working in consultation with local, state, community, and at the federal level, consulting with the CDC on what are the best measures to take. I even heard that the NBA is building biodomes to protect their greatest assets. They're multi-million-dollar asset basketball players, so they're doing everything possible. I don't know what the universities are doing in that regards, but I would assure you that from the tone that I'm hearing is that because we're living in such a hyper-transparent world, corporations are very cognizant that every behavior they take and every step they take to protect and support their employees is being watched by the world. So I think it really comes down to us as consumers to hold these corporations, which higher ed institutions are a part of, accountable.
Daniel, do you want to share some remarks?
Yeah, if you see me scanning all the questions, it looks like a lot of the questions are really about economics, and I'm going to defer to people who know a lot more about that than I think. One of the questions, of course, is about the second wave, and I do think I understand that people are concerned about the second wave, and I think there was also a question about, what about people who just graduated or are going to be graduating next year? And I think both of those things are somewhat related questions. I think it's going to be very important, first off, that all of us continue to seek the best information that we can get, that we anticipate that this is not going to be, in terms of the number of cases and number of fatalities, this is not going to be a steady curve, all right? We're going to see a lot of bumps up and down, and it's not going to be the same in every community, because every community is not going to be reopening at the same pace, and they're not even going to be using the same rules. So I think it's going to be very hard to give a single answer to that. So that's why I'm saying, like, stay informed. And for everyone out there looking, like, don't rely on national news. I'm not saying that national news isn't reliable, but I'm saying really look at what's happening in your community, because there are such huge discrepancies between the strategies that people are using and the strategies that local leaders are using, that you really want to use that information. And remember that deaths is the wrong thing to be looking at, because that's happening probably 2 to 4 to 6 weeks post exposure. Positives is a little bit better indicator because that's earlier on in the curve. So be paying attention to your local statistics as you track this. And I wish I had an answer for you, but there really isn't. It's going to be different in different parts of the country. The second wave, I think, is likely to happen, but it's also going to look different because people are reopening at such different paces. So wish I had more for you, but I would say just stay informed of what's happening in your local community.
Thanks so much, Daniel. So Robert, in a brief minute, do you want to conclude with some remarks?
Okay. Yes, thank you, Paulina. And again, thanks to everybody who was on this program. So come back to the letter of the recovery. You've heard a lot about a V. I think that's really hard to imagine happening. I talked about a swoosh, but that assumes, as we talked a little bit about, Daniel just mentioned this, no second wave or no surge. If we start having significant increases in cases somewhere down the line as we reopen the economy, then we would be looking at, well, all bets are off. I mean, we'd be looking more like at least maybe a W or something like that. So that's one thing. There was a question about whether or not we should be looking at buying homes and things like that at this point in time. That certainly depends on your own personal situation, but interest rates are very low, and that makes durable goods, houses, cars, and things like that very easy to finance if that's the case. There was another question about the Fed's actions affecting the distribution of income. Holy cow, this is something we need like a whole day to talk about. The distribution of wealth and income have both been shifting adversely over the last several decades. Frankly, the trigger for the civil and social unrest that we have experienced in recent weeks, was the tragic death of George Floyd. There could have been any number of triggers, and I'm really surprised we didn't actually have something like that occur, or something like this occur back during the period of the Great Recession. So we've had these inequity problems for decades, and we now have to confront them once again, and I think hopefully we do so in a meaningful way. The question of whether or not the Fed is sort of, through its policy, is contributing to economic inequities, that's a whole question for another day, but I think it's a great question. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Robert. And thanks, everybody. This was a great panel. Thanks to all our panelists and to all the attendees for the great questions. So I didn't get time to ask more, but thanks, everybody.